interesting there. So you talk about what you call human capitalism, the idea of changing our notion of capitalism where essentially it changes how we see the market. You say human capitalism would have a few core tenets. One, humanity is more important than money. Two, the unit of an economy is each person, not each dollar. And three, markets exist to serve our common goals and values. Well, on sort of an abstract, in a vacuum, I agree with a lot of that stuff, obviously. I mean, I have kids, I have parents, right? Humans matter more than money. And if you asked me to sell my child, obviously the answer is no. I like my kids, although it depends on the day. If you're asking, the units of an economy, dollars versus people, there I start to have a little more trouble just on the economic level, because what I'm actually paying for is a skill set, not a person. Obviously, the value of each human being is infinite, but the value of each human being's labor is certainly not. And then when you say markets exist to serve our common goals and values, this is what it's really interesting, because as I mentioned Tucker, because I think that you and Tucker Carlson are on the same page with regard to some of this stuff. So is Bernie Sanders, for that matter. The idea that markets exist to serve people, I think, is something with which I disagree, and I'll explain. When we talk about markets, my view of a market is essentially a recognition that my labor belongs to me. A free market is just my labor belongs to me, in the same way that free speech is my viewpoint belongs to me. You can't say that the markets exist to serve our common goals any more than you say that free speech exists to serve our common goals. Free speech is just a recognition that I, as an individual human being, have worth. And so free markets are the same thing. It's a recognition that I, as an individual human being, my labor has worth. So the idea that the market is just something that is an institution that we have come up with together and then we play with, I'm not sure that's an accurate description of what markets actually represent. There's an underlying value to human labor that is not just a common system we all decided to come up with one day. It's just a recognition that I can alienate my labor and you can buy my labor. Is that wrong?
Well, so to me, the fundamental shift that we have to start getting our arms around is that certain people's labor is not going to be worth enough for them to make the kind of living that is required for them to live what they would consider a good life. And so if you look at truck drivers as an example, because I use them because they're the most clear. So you have 3.5 million truckers making about $46,000 a year. And that it's a punishing job. They're behind the wheel of this truck for up to 14 hours a day, and they're away from their families 4 days a week, and the rest of it. But their market value, with the market of their time behind the wheel, it's about $46,000 a year. Now, if 5 to 10 years from now, my friends in Silicon Valley come up with trucks that can largely drive themselves, and then you're going to go to that truck driver and say, hey, turns out your market value, like your time behind the wheel, it's not 46,000 anymore. It's 26. It's 0. It's like whatever the number is, and so there's like a change building up in our economy that the freedom to trade your labor for money to make a good living for yourself, that's actually going to end up breaking down in more and more situations where that truck driver is no less willing to trade his time. I mean, he still wants to do it. But then the freight company is going to be like, turns out your time's not worth what it was. And it's not just the trucker. It could be a radiologist who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they interpret radiation films, say, I'm very willing to do this. Like, I like getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then we say, hey, turns out that AI can see tumors you can't, can refer to millions of films, not thousands, can see shades of gray that are invisible to the human eye. You lose. Like your time all of a sudden goes from worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to, let's call it, like half that or 0 or whatever the number is. And so I think that it worked for a long time when the average American could show up and say, if I'm willing to work hard and I've got a strong back, I can make a decent living for myself and my family. Like it was in the 70s, where if I showed up even to a manufacturing plant, I might be able to provide a middle class life for myself and my family. But then if that stops working, then we need to start thinking differently about how the labor market functions.
So if we've moved beyond sort of the concept of free markets as places where we can alienate labor because some people are not capable of alienating their labor is just not worth anything, then is the idea that the collective owns the labor of everybody and gets to redistribute the products of that labor? Is that what we're talking about here? Because it gets into dicey territory.
No, and I agree with that. And that's actually the outcome we have to avoid, if at all possible. And this is one reason why my flagship proposal is we give every American $1,000 a month free and clear, and that doesn't somehow usurp your labor, your time. That actually, if anything, liberates your labor, your time. That if you have a little bit more freedom from scarcity, then you can start making moves towards the sort of work that you want for yourself, that you value, that you would find fulfilling and exciting.
So one of the things that you talk about, and I think this is interesting because you are obviously a big believer in the ability of people to make choices with their own money, and this is why you believe in the freedom dividend. Is the idea I'm giving you the cash, it's your decision what to do with it.
Yeah.
At one point in the book, you talk about the idea that folks who are poorer in the United States are actually good with money, that essentially that they are going to be responsible with the money that they have. You say on page 185, the idea that poor people will be irresponsible with their money and squander it seems to be a product of deep-seated biases rather than emblematic of the truth. And you do this in sort of a broader attack on the meritocratic idea, in which you say, well, this isn't completely a meritocracy. Obviously, there's some people who are born into situations they can't control. You don't always control your own level of merit. That's sort of a meritocratic myth. And this is a position that's held by people, including Ross Douthat, who's sort of a more populist conservative at the New York Times. I wonder, however, if that's true. And the reason that I say that is because if you look at the spending habits of people who are lower down on the income chain, those spending habits don't tend to be more frugal than people who are at the upper levels of the income chain, at least not until those people at the upper levels are pretty secure in being at the upper levels. You see conspicuous consumption among people who are earning an insane amount of money because they can afford it. But the way that those people largely became people who can afford to do that is a certain level of frugality. I take, for example, the buying of lottery tickets. So the lowest income households in the United States on average spend $412 annually on lottery tickets. Almost 3 in 10 Americans in the lowest income bracket play the lottery once a week. Now, we know just statistically this is flushing your money down the toilet. It's a complete waste of time. There's no reason to do that. And I understand people do this out of despair, but that doesn't change the economic truth, which is that people may not make good decisions with their money, which is one of the reasons we have programs like Social Security. We don't trust you to keep your own money and put it in a 401k account. We believe that you're going to take that money and blow it on whatever you're going to blow it on. Are you worried that we grant UBI and then people just don't spend it on health insurance, or they don't spend it on saving for the future? Instead, they just spend it on whatever they're going to spend it on. It provides a temporary boost for the economy, and we're back in the same position because people at lower levels, at least people who tend to stay at lower levels, people who are permanently poor in the United States, don't tend to make great decisions with their money. Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, it's a concern, for sure. And one of the things that drives me is that there's been a lot of research over the fact that if you're poor, if you're stressed out about your month-to-month bills, it actually consumes a lot of your mental bandwidth. And it reduces your decision-making ability, it reduces your functional intelligence by 13 IQ points or 1 standard deviation. And so if you get the boot off of someone's throat and say, look, you're going to be here, your kid's going to be here, all will be well, then their incentives to save will hopefully be higher. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that like everyone's going to go and like do exactly what I would see as like optimally responsible with their money, but big picture, to return to your original point, I think it's their money. Like I think that if you're a citizen and shareholder of this country, we can easily afford a dividend of $1,000 a month, and if you make a bad decision or a decision I would consider like poor in January, maybe you'll make a better decision in February, maybe you'll make a better decision in March, but it's going to be up to you. It's going to be your life, your choices. And I certainly do not think that the government saying like, hey, we think you should just use the money on this or that, like would be a better way to go.
So that's a pretty libertarian idea, actually. So that doesn't seem to fit necessarily wholly within sort of the democratic belief that on the Democratic Party side, that when money is signed to you, that we have to kind of stand guard over the money. There are a lot of libertarians who believe in UBI, and they have the same sort of libertarian view, which is your money, you do with it what you want, you live with the consequences. Obviously, that comes with downsides from, I think, the left-wing point of view.
Well, I think many Americans have lost confidence that what we need is another program where someone comes in and says, hey, what we think is best for you? This.
We're in agreement on this.
So, I think many Americans are going to be very excited about being able to make their own decisions on this.
So let's talk about the cost side of this. So you proposed value-added tax. You point out that in Europe there is value-added tax, which is essentially a consumption tax. You want to add that on top of the income tax and the business tax as opposed to replacing it. If we were talking about replacing it, I'm on board with you, man. I'm totally for a VAT replacing whatever income tax system we have right now. Where do you think the breaking point is as far as how much the system can support in terms of taxation? Right now we're living pretty heavily on debt, obviously, and adding a bunch of new costs in the form of UBI or quashing economic growth to a certain extent, because as you increase the tax rate, at a certain point you're going to hit a breaking point. Where do you think the ideal tax rate lies? You're setting the taxes. How does the ideal tax system work?
Well, I agree with you that ideally we are not taxing labor in the same way we do now, because you don't want to tax things you need more of. And in my opinion, we need as much work